Welcome, I'm John Caldera, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. Later on, we're going to talk a bit about local government. There's a lot more power there than you could possibly imagine. But if you recall, the EPA is under attack by that evil administration, and here's one of the guys that helped create that evilness, Myron Ebell from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, John.
Now, you were the point person on the transition team for the Trump administration for the EPA.
That's right.
That must have been fun.
It was fun, yes.
Well, what was the most fun part about that?
Trying to turn the country around, trying to do my bit, my small part to try to turn the country around. That was satisfying.
All right, so now we're on public television here. So most people will be watching, one, they forgot the remote and they can't find it. The others are looking and go, you're ruining the country. We need the EPA. This is a beautiful state. We need to protect the environment of Colorado and our nation. And you anti-EPA folks who want to destroy the EPA, it's because you hate the environment. Give me the reaction to that. How do we protect the environment in Colorado if not for the EPA?
The EPA has largely achieved the mission that it was set in 1970 when it was created by an executive order by President Nixon. Most of the big environmental laws, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, nationally, the goals have been achieved. We have clean air, we have safe drinking water, we have clean water. There are still significant local problems. For example, air pollution is still a big problem in Southern California. It's largely the geography, not man as a polluter. But of course, in Colorado, we should be very aware that the EPA is also a problem. The Gold King mine disaster was created by the EPA, and they've been trying to cover that up ever since, and I hope the truth eventually comes out.
If you were able to wave a magic wand, though, and the EPA goes away, what happens to the environment here in Colorado? What happens to our beautiful lands, our water, our air, and the things that we in Colorado love and care about?
Well, you have a very capable State Department of Environmental Protection. Every state has one now. When EPA was created in 1970, I think California was the only one that had a significant environmental program. And so most of the work of the EPA on the big issues has already been devolved to the state agencies. So it's your state agency that is largely responsible for protecting the environmental quality in Colorado. And I would flip that and say one of the big environmental problems in Colorado and all the western states is federal land management. The biggest environmental problems are caused by the Forest Service, the BLM, the Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they, as you know, they control most of western Colorado. So I think the next step for the Obama administration is not only to reform and downsize the EPA, but it's to improve the management of our federal lands.
The short answer being, listen, we're Colorado. We can handle this.
Yes, and you care about it.
And nobody loves our land more than the people here in Colorado. We got this. We don't need faceless, nameless bureaucrats in D.C. to protect Colorado's water.
That is correct.
All right. Let me ask you about the transition. You mentioned something about the transition of Obama, and you gave Obama a compliment, which kind of shocked me a bit. So tell me what that is.
Well, when President Bush, George W. Bush, left office and there was the Obama administration transition, he directed everyone to really cooperate fully with President Obama and his team.
Because I remember 8 years before that, when the Clinton administration trashed the White House, took the W's off of keyboards, and throughout the entire administration and all the departments, it wasn't a smooth transition.
No.
It was a spiteful transition.
Yeah, there was a lot of ill will, and it was manifested in the way they treated the transition people. With the Obama administration and the Trump transition, the word clearly went down from the White House is that you were going to do this professionally. So, when I entered the EPA building for the first time, there was clearly a lot of animosity in that building towards me because not only because of my record, but also particularly because of President Trump's campaign promises to downsize the EPA and to get rid of the climate rules and withdraw the waters of the U.S. rule and so on. But I have to say, these people were utterly professional. They were very friendly. They treated us well. When we asked for things, appointments with to get briefed by senior officials, they set them up. They went out of their way to be helpful. So even though there's a huge...
But on the way in, it wasn't as as nice. The protesters outside, they treated you well.
Well, President Trump's campaign promises and my past career as being an opponent of a lot of the overregulation of the EPA and against the climate agenda of the Obama administration meant that the environmental pressure groups have been fairly hostile and fairly public about it, including protest demonstrations in front of the building where my offices
What did they
are.
do?
Well, they had a march from Georgetown University past George Washington University, which is, and then down L Street to our building on L Street, CEI's building. And they, by the time they got there, they still had a couple hundred people, even though it's a couple-mile march. So,
wow.
So
You got to feel complimented about that.
Well, and
I can't get people to walk across the street to insult me. This is huge.
You got to try harder, John. and there were protests in Berlin, Cambridge, Massachusetts. When I went to Brussels after the inauguration, there was a Greenpeace protest there. So I attract friends wherever I go.
That's a beautiful thing. Let's talk from the general end. We're talking about proposed cuts to the EPA. Let's start there. The president wants to cut the EPA budget by 30%. Now, I listen to National Public Radio. I know how evil that is. I've heard how awful it's going to be, how the cuts will mean horrific things. Is it possible to cut the EPA budget by 30%? And really, what does that look like?
I think it leads to an agency that is fully capable of performing the missions that Congress has given it. There are statutory requirements for pollutants under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the cleaning up Superfund sites. There are all these mandates that Congress has given it. A 30% cut means, however, that EPA will have to give up on all of its optional activities, and in particular, the climate agenda laid out by President Obama. Because, people say, oh, they're already short-staffed, but the Clean Air Office, the Air Office, President Obama was able to put a lot of those people on detail for the climate program. So clearly they have enough people and they can have significant cuts.
You use the term optional mission, optional work. You're telling me, for those who don't know, EPA was created. Congress said, you will do this, 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 and this. They never talked about a clean power plan. They never talked about climate change or global warming. That wasn't the purpose of EPA. Do you think with a 30% cut, it gets back to the original core functions of the EPA?
I think
or does it hurt those core functions?
Yes, President Trump made it clear during the campaign that he wanted the EPA to concentrate on its core mission of clean air and clean water, and that could be done with a much smaller staff because over the decades, most of the actual work has been devolved to the state agencies. The Clean Air Act permitting is done by the state environmental agencies. So a lot of these career civil servants in the federal bureaucracy have really outlived their usefulness. And I think it became clear to me during the transition that there are a lot of people in the EPA headquarters in Washington and in many of the regional offices whose primary function now is cooperating with other agencies. Well, actually, we don't need them to cooperate. If we eliminate those positions, the people at the other agencies at the state level who are doing the work can get on with it.
Climate change. So if EPA under Obama was tasked with taking on climate change, which was out of its purview, never was authorized by Congress, and therefore one of the many things that Obama did that was extra legal.
Right.
Right. What does it say now? You think that we need to pull out of the Paris Accords, and what is it that we're supposed to do then on climate change? What and why?
The Paris Climate Treaty it would never be ratified by the U.S. Senate if President Trump decides to send it there. Now, President Obama tried to pretend that it wasn't a treaty and that he could just, through executive fiat, join it. The fact is that we have only had two elections where global warming was an issue. One was after cap and trade passed the House in 2009 and the Senate didn't vote on it. In the 2010 elections, the Democrats in the House were swept away, but not in the Senate. This election was the first presidential election where both candidates laid out a very strong position on global warming. Hillary
Two opposite opinions.
Yeah, two opposite opinions. Donald Trump won, Hillary Clinton lost. And I think wherever you are in global warming, I think you need to understand that this was part of his agenda. The global warming pieces fit in very closely with let's get America back to work. And not just the financial centers in New York and Silicon Valley. Let's get the people who make stuff, dig up stuff, and grow stuff for a living back to work. And that involves an energy renaissance. And of course, that's been happening through the shale revolution. But for example, on the western slope in Colorado, oil production has not been going up and gas production because the Obama administration has done everything they can to limit it. And of course,
hasn't been just on the federal level. There's been a lot of work on the state level. This used to be a state where to get a permit to drill was the fastest application process in the country. Whether you got a thumbs up or a thumbs down, you knew quickly. Now we're one of the slowest to let businessmen know if this is something they can proceed with or not. So the cost of compliance has skyrocketed. So they're moving their rigs to, guess where? Wyoming and Oklahoma.
Yeah, well, and also the coal leasing moratorium affects Colorado and Wyoming and Montana. So President Trump said he wants to unleash energy production, coal, oil, and gas on federal land and offshore areas, and this will turn America into the world's dominant energy superpower. That will have geopolitical effects. It will reduce the influence of OPEC and the Arab oil producers to manipulate oil prices. That will be good for the global economy.
You are so very dangerous. And here's why. It's short-sighted. You should know that by taking this path of fossil fuels, you're not just dooming the United States, you're dooming the human race by the pollution that is going to be unleashed by what you just described.
The fact is that global greenhouse gas emissions are going to go up significantly in the next 20 to 30 years, regardless of whether the United States stops using fossil fuels completely, because there's a huge number of people in the world who have no electricity or very little electricity, particularly in India, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, even some parts of South America and Southeast Asia. There's 1.2 billion people who have access to no electricity at all, and there's another billion or more who have very little electricity.
They're going to have wind farms.
They're not.
They're going to have wind farms in those villages.
No, they're not.
They're going to have solar power.
They're not.
There's a way to do it. Let me ask you this last question. And the Competitive Enterprise Institute has been one of the leaders on being skeptical of climate science, to the point where you guys are ridiculed constantly. To the point, and I think this is one of the reasons why Trump won. You know, the absolute hatred of anybody with an opposing opinion, to the point where if you oppose an opinion or have a different opinion on the causes of climate change, you're not just wrong on the issue, you are a denier, to be just like a Holocaust denier. And this is pretty evil stuff. People want to learn more, because we probably don't have time to get into it, but that the position on climate change, one, is it real? Two, is it man-made? And three, where do they go to get that information so that they can laugh at you over the internet?
Well, there are many places. One is CEI.org, another one is CO2science.org, a third is heartland.org. I would say this, the rate of warming has been exaggerated. The potential impacts of warming have either been exaggerated or made up, and the costs of trying to reduce emissions have been vastly underestimated, and consequently, there is the global warming industry, the climate industrial complex, has put us in a fantasy position of thinking that doom is right around the corner. It isn't. The rate of warming is modest, unlike what the computer models have predicted. There's a wide divergence between the predictions and the data. And so I think people need to concentrate on the data, and then they need to understand that the costs of doing it are huge, and yet the effects of reducing emissions are very minimal.
Myron, thank you so much. CEI.org, get a hold of you and tell you what an evil person you are. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Stay tuned.